Thank you all for joining us here in our Douglas and Sarah Allison Auditorium. I'd like to take this time to remind everyone in the house to turn off cell phones. And for your future information, this program will be recorded and posted to our website within 24 hours. For those who might be watching online, you're welcome to submit questions to speaker@heritage.org. Hosting today's program is Kim Holmes. He holds the position of Distinguished Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Recently, he assumed this position after having served for 2 decades as the Vice President of Foreign and Defense Policy Studies and as Director of the Catherine and Shelby Cullum Davis Institute for International Studies. He also served as Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization Affairs during the President George W. Bush's first term, overseeing 7 diplomatic missions and managing U.S. engagement at the United Nations and over 45 other organizations. With that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Holmes.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank all of you for coming here today. It was, I'm sure it was a challenge for some of you getting stuck in the traffic. We were wondering whether anybody would show up, frankly. I came here this morning and I had forgotten this day was the 50th anniversary of the Martin Luther King speech, and I turned on the radio and they were talking about all of these difficulties getting around Washington, and I thought, what an idiot. I chose this day to have this session. So, but I thank all of you for coming nonetheless. We begin today a series of discussions on the future of American foreign policy, and a number of changes seem to be afoot in the opinions of Americans and politicians and experts, and so we thought it might be a good time to put together a series of these kinds of discussions. Today is the first one that we're having. The next panel is going to be on September 18th, and I hope that if you like this one, that you will come back for that one. It will be featuring Will Inboden, the University of Texas at Austin, Rich Williamson, who's held many positions in American foreign policy positions in government, and Ted Broman, our senior fellow here at Heritage, and I will be hosting that event as well. I'd like to begin by laying out the premise of the discussion. Then we can get the reaction from our 2 distinguished panelists, whom I'll introduce in just a moment. The title of today's discussion is A New Look at American Foreign Policy. The assumption behind that title, and the reason why I convened these series of discussions, is that I believe American foreign policy and also foreign policy opinions are in flux. Libertarian-minded conservatives are joining liberals in their critiques of military interventions, defense spending, and surveillance practices of the NSA. Some conservatives on the other side are worried that libertarian conservatives are becoming isolationists. At the same time, people who are sometimes called neoconservatives are drifting close to what used to be understood as the humanitarian interventionist wing of the Democratic Party, a wing which ironically is not as influential in this administration as it was in previous ones. The question is whether there's anything new here, anything significant here, and whether or not, if there are anything new or significant, whether it amounts to the possibility of a realignment of views on American foreign policy. A few weeks back, I wrote a series of articles in the Foreign Policy magazine online where I addressed these questions. So let me spend a few minutes outlining what I said there to sort of key up the discussion. For the last decade or so, American foreign policy views have been roughly divided into 3 camps. The first of these I would call pullback. It's found largely in the academic world, but also on the wings of the Democratic and Republican parties. Its main premise is that American foreign policy is too militaristic, overly involved in the using of force to control overseas events. Now, you find people in this camp both from the political left, but also the libertarian right. The bottom line is that we're doing too much abroad, and even though the reasons for the libertarians and the liberals for reaching those conclusions are entirely different. The second I call retrenchment. It roughly corresponds to the views of the Obama administration. It has a liberal intent, but it's modest in its execution. It worries more about the limits of power than the possibilities. Its dominant theme is that American power is increasingly limited and that we must adjust to this new limited position of America in the world with fewer interventions, but also a smaller military footprint overseas. And there is in this worldview a reluctance to use military force abroad. And even though we are now, of course, in the middle of a debate with the Obama administration considering it in Syria, I still think that President Obama himself is still quite reluctant to use force abroad. The third camp are conservative hawks, for lack of a better way of describing them. They believe that American power is constantly being tested around the world, and any failure to respond forthrightly signals American weakness and the possibility of the loss of American credibility around the world. American credibility is the watchword of this group. There is a heavy streak of moralism fused with a broad definition of national security in this group, and I think that Senator McCain perhaps best captures this worldview. So here again is the problem, or the question that I'm posing. These categories, as I've laid them out, and by the way, I hope we just don't have a debate quibbling about whether or not these are the right categories. I'm not capturing the nuances of every possible person and the like. I'm just trying to get a conversation going. But the problem is that, at least as I have defined them, these categories are fraying at the edges. Senator McCain feels more comfortable with someone who is a self-avowed liberal, Samantha Powers, than he does with Rand Paul. Rand Paul's denunciation of the NSA is closer to the views of Barney Frank than to, say, Steve Hadley, who was George W. Bush's national security advisor. And many liberals are unhappy with the Obama administration. Michael Crapon called his foreign policy ambitionless. And of course, many liberals are unhappy not only with the president's drone policies, but his counterterrorism policies in general. But not just to talk about Democrats and the president, congressional conservatives in the Republican Party, like Senator McConnell and House Speaker Boehner, have embraced the so-called sequester, which is gutting the defense budget more so than it is domestic programs. A strong national defense since the days of Reagan has been one of the sacred cows of the Republican Party. If you look at the leadership of the Congress, of the Republican Party in Congress, that is no longer the case. Now, there's no great mystery about why this is happening. There's a general weariness in the American public with the various wars that we've been engaged in over the last decade. Look at the opinion polls about the intervention of whether you support the intervention in Syria. The American people is down practically in the basement at 9% or something like that, as I saw yesterday. Also, the Tea Party has accentuated the libertarian wing of the conservative movement. Libertarians had always been there, but they've been mainly engaged on the domestic side of the debate. But today they are ascendant as well in the foreign policy side of the debate, helping to define what conservatism is in the foreign policy area, and therefore challenging the old mantra that had been in the conservative movement since Ronald Reagan of peace through strength. The fiscal crisis means there's less money for everybody to go around, and this is squeezing everybody's ideology from the left and from the right. From the left, it means that if you're a liberal Democrat and you want more money for domestic programs, it means the defense budget is a place to get that money. If you're on the right, you want all government spending to drop, including that of the Department of Defense. The president, as far as the president's so-called liberal internationalist agenda, as I said before, it's liberal intent, but it's modest in its execution. Frankly, President Obama's heart is not really in foreign policy, as you can see from his reluctance to engage in these issues, and certainly his reluctance to use force in Syria. I think he mainly cares about his domestic policy agenda, and he sees an overly ambitious sort of liberal internationalism as at least a distraction and possibly also a risk if it were to go wrong and could threaten his presidency. The bottom line on the left and the right is that both the left and the right are weary of big ideas in foreign policy. Conservatives are not as keen on advancing freedom and democracy as they once were, particularly if it involves the use of force, and liberals are more modest in promoting their humanitarian and internationalist causes overseas, including, I would argue, even at the United Nations. So far-reaching strategies to transform the world are simply out of fashion. So the question is, are we witnessing any permanent realignment of views? To be honest, I can play it safe and say probably too early to say, too early to tell. I mean, what else can we say? We don't know what will happen in the future. But at the very least, there's something going on, and I think there's a possibility for us, whether we're libertarians, Reagan conservatives, or even liberals, to have an honest discussion about what this new world that we live in means for the future of our foreign policy. There may even be some middle ground that we hadn't considered before. One area where I would throw out as a possibility is that we more narrowly define the purposes of American power, particularly military power. Purpose would not be to engineer domestic arrangements of foreign states, whether for, if you're a liberal, humanitarian purposes, or if you're a conservative, for freedom agenda or democracy purposes, but rather to maintain a global balance of power. That could be the substructure, if you will, for states to have democratic regimes and to enjoy their own freedom. But that would be a derivative objective rather than a primary one. This could mean that you would have fewer military interventions. Some people call them wars of choice. But the reason here, at least the way I would see it, was not so much because we think we can't afford them or use of force is morally wrong, but rather we don't deem them to be necessary unless they serve the national interest of the United States. Now, before somebody jumps immediately saying, oh, that's great, there's a conservative up there saying we need a smaller defense budget, not so fast. This view I just outlined also could mean that we actually have a military that's already too weak to even do the deterrent purposes that I'm talking about here. Just because you don't want to go around willy-nilly using military force doesn't mean that you want a weak military force that can't win the wars when you want to use them. As a matter of fact, the old peace through strength mantra from Ronald Reagan is to be so absolutely strong that nobody will dare challenge you. That's certainly not the case today. So I would not necessarily conclude that just because we have a narrow definition of military power, that means that we can just therefore cut the defense budget in half. I do not believe that's the case. Tell you the truth, what I fear most is if we don't have this discussion, is it will get the worst of all possible worlds. You'll get libertarian-minded conservatives teaming up with liberals to gut the defense budget and send the nation into terminable military decline. That's one fear I have. Or, on the other hand, interventionist-minded conservatives, who, by the way, also think we can cut the defense budget, will team up with liberal humanitarians, like someone like Samantha Power before she became United Nations ambassador, to involve America in wars where we lack the military capability to win, or the will to win, or the backing of the American people to win. So that's not a world that we want to live in. But politically, that's sort of where we are right now and where we could be in the future. I think that, even though I said what I said about military interventions, I think that if we want to have a discussion with our liberal friends, they need to recognize something as well, and that is that they need to admit that their longstanding faith in soft power and international governance, particularly working through the UN as a substitute for hard military power, has been misplaced, exaggerated, and the expectations of succeeding there have been way too high. So I think that, frankly, given the fact that there's more talk about what to do with the UN from this Obama administration than real action, and I was Assistant Secretary of State for international organizations for George W. Bush, and we were working with the UN all the time, and frankly, we engaged them on a day-to-day basis probably more than this administration did, or is doing. But there is a gap between the rhetoric and the reality of what they're doing in this area, and that may be an opening for us to have a more honest conversation with them about the expectations of international governance. Now, for all this to happen, we have to have open minds. I think we have to, and I'm sure that my colleagues here will do that. But you already see new alliances working out between McCain and on one hand and Rand Paul and his allies on the other. The question is whether or not there may be a third way in which we weave together some kind of of a way of maintaining not only the, as a conservative, as the most important things to me as a conservative, but more importantly, the basis for maintaining American leadership in the world for the foreseeable future that both liberals and conservatives can agree to. Now, that's what I think. I've laid it out here. Now we'll see what our panelists say in response. I'll introduce both of them, and then I ask Paul Saunders to come up first, but let me introduce them. The first speaker will be Paul Saunders. He's the executive director at the Center for the National Interest and a member of the Center's board of directors. He's the chief operating officer for the Center, and he also is an expert on U.S.-Russian relations, and he directs the Center's program on U.S.-Russian relations. But he's also interested in other things like U.S.-Japan relations and also climate change. He's the associate publisher of the Foreign Policy magazine that's attached to the Center, the National Interest. He served in the Bush administration as a senior advisor to the Undersecretary of State for Global Affairs. Following Paul will be Colin Duke, who is an associate professor at George Mason University's Department of Public and International Affairs. He studied at Princeton and international relations at Oxford under a Rhodes Scholarship. He's written 2 books on American foreign policy and national security. One's called Hardline, The Republican Party and U.S. Foreign Policy Since World War II, which was published by Princeton. He also has published many articles, and he's working on a book right now. Can I tell them what it's called? The Obama Doctrine. Or as I said to him, he probably should make that plural, because it has changed a bit over the time. But at any rate, thank you all for listening to me. So, Paul, I think from now on, if you don't mind, I think we're all just going to sit down here and speak from down here.
Thank you very much, Kim, and I'd like to commend Kim and also the Heritage Foundation for having this session and the whole series, really, because I think this is a very important time for reflection and debate about our foreign policy, and I think there is an opportunity to make some changes and to find some middle ground. So I think this is very valuable, and look forward to hearing Colin and also engaging with all of you. I'm going to divide my comments into 2 sections. The first section, I want to very briefly look back and explain how I think it is that we came to be where we are now in our foreign policy. And then after that, I'd like to talk a little bit about the way forward. In terms of where we are now, I see really 2 principal factors that got us to this place where we're having this discussion, ferment, frustration, even, I think, with our foreign policy. The first one that I would really point to is our victory in the Cold War. And certainly it was a good thing to prevail in the Cold War, and very important for Americans and for the rest of the world. But after that victory, I think a number of people in our foreign policy establishment and our political leadership stopped thinking about limits and costs in our foreign policy. People had been trained for 50 years in our foreign policy establishment as you were going through a decision-making process on policy. Well, okay, we can do this, but then what will the Soviets do? And after the Soviets do that, then where will we be, and how do we react to that? But after the end of the Cold War, I think we saw in our foreign policy that this question of, what will the other side do, and no matter who the other side might be in any particular situation, it was a question that we really stopped asking. Mainly, I think because there wasn't one single force like the Soviet Union, but also because we had this enormous sense of self-confidence. I mean, we had defeated the Soviets. How could anyone else really create any problems for us? And I think as a result of that, you saw in the 1990s a real evolution in our foreign policy, and Kim talked a little bit about this, The Clinton administration, very much in a liberal interventionist mode, determined to use military power to go and right the ills of the world, and winning increasingly support from a number of people in the Republican Party. There were clearly a number of Republicans who actually changed their minds. And I'm going to read you a quote right now, and I apologize. I'm going to read probably 3 or 4 quotes, which I usually don't do, but I think this is a powerful one and an interesting one. Many may remember the Lebanese Civil War in the early 1980s. There was a very prominent U.S. senator whose name I will divulge after I read the quote, who said the following: "The fundamental question is, what is the U.S. interest in Lebanon? It is said that we are there to keep the peace. I ask, what peace? It is said that we are there to aid the government. I ask, what government? It is said that we are there to stabilize the region. I ask, how can the U.S. president stabilize the region? The longer we stay in Lebanon, the harder it will be for us to leave. We will be trapped by the case we make for having troops there in the first place. What can we expect if we withdraw from Lebanon? The same as will happen if we stay. I acknowledge that the level of fighting will increase if we leave. I regretfully acknowledge that many innocent civilians will be hurt, but I firmly believe this will happen in any event." That was Senator John McCain. Just to give you an idea of how people changed in this period of the during the Cold War period to the period of the 1990s. And I think McCain was certainly one of the larger evolutions. But I think that's a very striking statement. And it was only about 2 months after, or 1 month after McCain made that statement, that the Marine barracks bombing took place in Beirut. And President Reagan pulled the Marines out of Lebanon. The second thing that happened, which I think also played a major role in getting us where we are, was, of course, September 11th. That clearly created a sense of really urgent danger, to the United States that I think most Americans had not felt for a long time, and a need to do something about it. At the same time, I think it had a tendency, unfortunately, to stifle debate in some cases. I think it also became an important justification for domestic surveillance, which we're also having a little bit of a debate about today. And when you take these two factors of feeling an urgent threat and really wanting to do something about it, on one hand, with kind of an idea that we're not thinking so much about the cost, the limits, what the other side will do, the consequences, and you put them together, I think that got us into the foreign policy that we had for much of the recent period. I do think it's now changing. I think there is, as I said at the beginning, a real sense of frustration among many, conservatives and liberals both. There's a sense that the costs are high. There's a sense that in some cases the danger may have receded. Some may feel that we could have done better in solving particular problems, and maybe we should engage in a little bit more reflection on our policy. So I do think this is a good opportunity, as I said before, to think and to debate. Moving forward, I would really highlight 3 issues as issues to think about that I hope will be a key focus in the debate that we have. I will call them interests, values, and leadership, just to give you easy bullet points. On interests, I would point to two particular challenges. I think we've had a problem of what I would call interest inflation, and also a problem of interest creep. Now, interest inflation is, every time any senator or member of Congress wants to do something, it's in the vital interest of the United States that we do it, they say. But what does vital mean? What is actually in the vital interest of the United States? My definition of the vital interest of the United States is something that is truly essential to preserving the security of the country and to preserving our way of life in a form that our children would recognize and want to be part of. There are a lot of things that people talk about now as vital that I don't really think are vital by that standard. They may be important, they may be very important, they may be extremely important, but they're not vital. And I think it would serve us well to take a little bit more intellectually rigorous approach to defining what our interests are. The problem of interest creep, is a related problem, and I've given it a name, that sounds enough like mission creep that I think people have a good idea of what I'm talking about. You do something, and then you kind of create an interest in following it up and making sure that it works. The quote that I read from John McCain, he was kind of talking about a situation like that in Lebanon. We put our people there, and once our people are there, then we have all of these other interests that we have to worry about. If you look at a situation like Syria today, and I'm not arguing for not doing anything, we can talk about that a little bit more in the questions. But if you look at a situation like Syria today, that's clearly a situation where it's a situation that's prone to this same logic. I guess I would put it that way. And if we look back historically, this has been something that's happened very extensively to global powers throughout history. And one particular one I would point to is the British Empire. The British didn't go to India thinking that they would conquer and rule all of India. They set up a few colonies on the coast of India, and once they had colonies, then they were worried about the security of the colonies because there was this, Indian prince who was on the other side of the river or the mountain or whatever. So they decided that they needed to go and take care of that guy, and they expanded a little bit. And then there was some other prince, who was a little bit on the other side, and they really needed to do something about him if they were going to protect this new territory that they had just taken over. And it acquired its own dynamics. And pretty soon you had a British Empire in India. Partway through that process, actually at the early stages of that process, the British also got into a war with the French, which we call the French and Indian War. It's the 7 Years' War in Europe. And I'm sorry to digress about history, but I think it makes a useful point. Where they managed to mostly drive the French out of North America, just Quebec really remaining in French hands. And had a much greater interest here. But they were trying to do these two things at the same time. And the British government borrowed enormous amounts of money to do that, to the point that interest payments were about 62% of annual revenue of the British government. So what did they decide to do? They decided that they needed to increase taxes. But it was politically too difficult to increase taxes in Britain because of the Parliament. So where did they decide to increase taxes? They increased taxes in the American colonies. And, we kind of know how that turned out, right? So My point is there are a lot of unintended consequences, and we need to think a little bit about the interests that we define for ourselves and the ways that we allow them to expand, and the degree to which we can really do everything at the same time. I'll be faster on my last 2 points. I apologize. Morality. America has to have a moral foreign policy. I mean, it's who we are. It's what the American people want, and I think it's what all of us should want too. But this is another area where definitions, like in the case of interests, actually really matter. And what I would point to here is, do we want our foreign policy to be moral when judged by the standards of what we say, of what we hope for? Or do we want our policy to be moral in terms of the outcome, what actually happens after we take a particular step? And I think there's a very big difference in many cases. It's not enough just to go and make politically attractive statements and take a moral posture. You have to pursue a policy that will have a moral outcome. And I'm going to indulge myself here and read another quote, and I apologize. This one is from George Kennan, who, of course, is the paragon of realism. And Kennan is talking about this very issue and is urging policymakers to avoid, and here's the quote, the histrionics of moralism at the expense of its substance. By that I mean the projection of attitudes, poses, and rhetoric that cause us to appear noble and altruistic in the mirror of our own vanity, but lack substance when related to the realities of international life. It is a sad feature of the human predicament in personal as in public life that whenever one has the agreeable sensation of being impressively moral, one probably is not. I think that's something we need to think about a little bit more in our foreign policy. And let me give actually another illustration. Ronald Reagan. Most people remember Reagan's famous Evil Empire speech about the Soviet Union. And many people look back, I think, very warmly on Reagan's moral clarity and want to see more of that in our foreign policy. Let me just remind anyone who hasn't recently read that speech that Reagan did call the Soviet Union an evil empire, and he was very clear in taking a moral stand against it. But he said two other very important things in that speech. The first was that the United States had its own legacy of evil that we needed to work through as a country. And the second was that despite the Soviet Union being evil, we should not isolate ourselves, and we needed to work with them on issues important to us. Now, this approach of Reagan's, I think, has often been a little bit written out of how some of our neoconservative friends remember Reagan and how they use Reagan in justifying their own approaches. But from my point of view, I think it's quite important. First of all, it's much more persuasive in dealing with others around the world when we acknowledge our own challenges. And that doesn't mean, apologizing or anything else. It means being honest with ourselves and being honest with others. and Reagan was certainly comfortable doing that. Secondly, not isolating ourselves. And there are evil people out there in the world, but we have important and even vital interests as a country that often require us to deal with them, whether we like it or not. Final thing, leadership. American leadership, I think, actually is a vital interest to the United States. It benefits us enormously, and I would not want to see the United States not leading. The challenge that I think we have moving forward is again a challenge of definition. What does it mean to be a global leader, and what does leadership mean? And we have moved as a society and as a foreign policy elite into a place where leadership is usually defined by the number of cruise missiles or jets that we're sending someplace. When that is an important aspect of our leadership, and it's certainly an area where no one can seriously challenge the United States, and it's a component of our power that underlies our ability to do many other things. But it's not the only element of our power, and it's not the only element of our leadership. Actually, I think it is rather likely that if you look around at the rest of the world, we are much more respected for our economic successes, for our scientific and technological innovation, for our free and open society, for all of the things that attract people to come to the United States. As many have said, Bob Gates and Admiral Mullen recently, but also many others, without the American economy, there won't be an American military that can lead the rest of the world. So I would encourage all of us moving forward to think about what leadership for the United States really means in foreign policy, and as well as I mentioned, what morality really means and what our interests really are. And let me end right there. I'm sorry if I went too long.
That's fine.
I
Thank you, Paul.
apologize.
Thank you, Paul. Colin.
Okay, thank you. Well, I was asked to respond to some essays that Kim wrote, and his talk gave a very good summary of them. I'd actually recommend you go look at them online, a 3-part series. And the questions he asked were, is a new direction possible, and are ideological changes afoot? So I'll just respond to that very briefly. I thought that Kim's remarks were very balanced and thoughtful and sensible, and I agreed with almost all of it, both in terms of the lay of the land and the desired course. I have a little different take in the end on the answer. On the question of are ideological changes afoot, there's no doubt this is very much as Kim described. The general public is disinterested in foreign policy right now. Even inside the Republican Party, you see a lack of enthusiasm for military interventions compared to 5 or 10 years ago. I'm going to qualify this in a minute, but there clearly are ideological changes afoot. Is a new direction possible, like the one Kim outlined? This depends a little bit on what you mean. If you mean, could the U.S. follow a foreign policy like the one he described, the answer is yes. If you mean, will there be a bipartisan consensus on this, I wouldn't hold my breath. And I'll say more about that in a minute. First, on the possibility of a new consensus, that would involve, by definition, a consensus between liberals and conservatives. And I love the Heritage Foundation, but this is, after all, a conservative think tank, and I think there's reasons to doubt that our liberal friends will agree on some of the key points. public opinion polls show, for example, that most liberals at the base of the Democratic Party do not actually share many of the themes that Dr. Holmes outlined in his talk. For example, the clear commitment to U.S. military superiority, robust counterterrorist measures, and the global balance of power. Actually, many liberals are deeply skeptical of U.S. military power, counterterrorism, and of concepts like the balance of power. So, if anything, there is a progressive critique of Obama's foreign policy from the left when it comes to issues like drones and Afghanistan. But liberals stomach Obama's foreign policy because they believe, quite rightly, I think, that he shares their core ideological commitments at home, even if he is very flexible in how he pursues them. Now, whenever a Republican president is inaugurated, whether it's in 2017 or some distant date beyond that, my prediction, unfortunately, is liberals will abandon many of the very same foreign policies they have reluctantly supported under Barack Obama. And they will sound more like the anti-war activists of 2006 or even 1968. There is, of course, a kind of establishment Washington wing of the Democratic Party where many of its members are more serious on foreign policy, more centrist and more practical. But that wing will lose significant influence if and when Democrats lose power, I'm sorry to say. On the other hand, could the United States follow a foreign policy like the one Kim recommends under a Republican president? I do think so. I think that's entirely possible. Why do I say that? First of all, one of the conclusions I came to with my last book is it's really presidents that make foreign policy. It's not public opinion. It's certainly not academics. It's not journalists or pundits. It's presidents. And presidents are given remarkable leeway precisely because of the fact that most people are not voting on foreign policy issues most of the time. In fact, presidents tend to pull their own parties with them on foreign policy, as Obama has and as George Bush certainly did. So that's one reason that I think a Republican president would have the freedom to pursue the kind of policies that Kim favors. Another reason is what he's outlined is not a bad fit for American public opinion right now. I mean, within the Republican Party and within the general public, there are certainly some that would say Dr. Holmes' suggestions go too far. Others say they don't go far enough, but that's not always a bad place to be politically. So I think that actually might be a good fit. In other words, scaling back some of the more sweeping ambitions from, say, 10 years ago, but still maintaining a kind of American engagement in the world. Now, what would you need to make this happen? You would need a Republican presidential candidate who actually shares these beliefs and is willing to make foreign policy a priority, independent of domestic political concerns. In particular, you would need one willing to pursue a coherent strategy overseas. All that takes, and I say this tongue-in-cheek, is having such a candidate win the Republican presidential nomination and the White House. Until that happens, there isn't going to be a consensus inside the Republican Party. If you look at American history, we don't have consensus when parties are out of power. And it's for the very reasons Kim outlined. And in our time in particular, during the Obama era, there really is a wide range of views among conservatives and Republicans. And at the risk of oversimplification, I will say there's two doors the Republican Party could walk through heading into 2016. Door number one would reflect the rise of a strong anti-interventionist strain inside the Republican Party. This, in some ways, is spillover from domestic concerns and focus on limited government, opposition to President Obama, and revelations, for example, regarding the NSA. But there's also genuine opposition, senators like Rand Paul, to current counterterrorism practices, to U.S. intervention in the Middle East, and a kind of retrospective judgment on the Bush years. So a candidate like that would, I assume, be willing to cut defense further than it's already been cut, scale back America's presence overseas militarily, and disentangle the U.S. in many ways from its existing strategic commitments. That's door number one. Door number two is the door favored by what is still actually a strong and vocal component of conservative and Republican foreign policy hawks and internationalists. And they believe that the U.S. must maintain and strengthen its forward presence overseas, that defense spending has fallen too far, that the U.S. is today viewed as rather weak and disengaged overseas, that President Obama has been in many cases overly accommodating to possible adversaries. And here's the thing, you don't have to be a neoconservative to believe those things. There are lots of conservatives and lots of Republicans who believe that, even including those who've never heard of the word neoconservative. And if you look inside the Tea Party, there are many potential Tea Party candidates on the right wing of the Republican Party who believe that. So this phrase, Tea Party isolationism, nobody's used it in this room, but it gets used by journalists outside. This is not the political reality. I will say, though, that the differences between these two doors are significant. I mean, these are two very different doors the Republican Party could go through. And that door number one, that anti-interventionist option, is a live option today. Maybe for the first time since 1952, when Senator Robert Taft represented that option. It is a live option in 2016. Now, there may be some commonalities between these two groups, for example, on missile defense, questions of national sovereignty or multilateralism. Certainly both groups agree that Obama's foreign policy has not been great. Okay? But the differences between the two groups are real, and they may not be reconcilable. So as much as I admire Dr. Holmes' search for a middle ground, I do think Republicans are going to have to make a choice. Conservatives are going to have to decide, heading into 2016, what do we stand for when it comes to foreign policy? The anti-interventionist route, door number one, would be, in effect, a critique of President Obama for doing too much, for example, on counterterrorism. Is that really how most conservatives and Republicans feel? I guess we'll find out. The current public opinion polling from the last few years suggests it isn't. And I mentioned a minute ago, even inside the Tea Party, the polls show that Republicans who support the Tea Party are more likely to support U.S. military commitments, defense spending, and American international leadership overseas than the average American. They certainly don't agree with the version of internationalism pursued by President Obama. But the historical record shows, since, say, the 50s, conservatives are typically the last group willing to surrender U.S. military superiority. And that's true on the right as well. So I happen to like Kim's framework from a prescriptive point of view because it says, let's tone down some of the more naive arguments that we sometimes hear for intervention, but let's maintain the baseline of America's forward presence, including support for U.S. allies, keeping the sea lanes open, checking U.S. adversaries, preserving the international balance of power, and maintaining clear U.S. military superiority. And by the way, doing it in a coherent fashion. This, by the way, would be a new direction compared to what we've had for the last 4.5 years. But even this is going to come under serious challenge over the next couple of years because of ideological shifts that we have all identified, including within the Republican Party. So I don't think there's going to be any consensus anytime soon. And to end on a cheerful note, that's okay. That's okay. This is what parties do when they lose one or two presidential elections. They argue about what they should stand for. They debate the issues, they debate their identities. So I would say more panels like this, let's let the debate happen. That's why we have presidential primaries. The only way this is going to get settled on the Republican side is once the Republican Party nominates a presidential candidate. And at that point, most of the party will line up behind that candidate.
Thank you, gentlemen. It's exactly what I wanted. Very good. You got us off to a great start. A lot of food for thought. I have some remarks I'll probably make at some point in reaction to all this, but I think I want to give first all of you a chance to react or ask questions or make any comments. We have until, well, we actually have about another 35 minutes. We have microphones on both sides of the auditorium. If you could, wait until you get to the auditorium. Identify yourself very briefly if you could, and then fire away with what's on your mind. Who wants to go first? Can we call on somebody from Heritage first, David?
Hi. Is it on?
It's on, yeah.
My name is David Azarad. I work here at the Heritage Foundation. Could preferably all three of you give us a sense of what should be the guiding aims of U.S. foreign policy? Mr. Saunders talked about that a little bit, but in general terms. And also explain where you derive these aims from, i.e. justify your answer.
All right, gentlemen, justify your answers. Anybody want to go first?
I can happily go first. You know, I would start by trying to define what America's vital interests actually are. And we did this, as a matter of fact, about 15 years or so ago in a report. And I would list off a few things kind of off the top of my head. I won't necessarily remember everything, but I can give you some good ideas. I think first, as I mentioned in my comments, I think U.S. leadership is a vital interest. mostly because of the other things that it allows us to do, and because losing our international leadership could make it much more difficult to secure our other interests, our other vital interests. Non-proliferation, nuclear non-proliferation, is a vital interest. One nuclear weapon detonating somewhere in the United States would change what it means to live in America. And I think that's something that we need to prevent from happening, particularly the nexus of terrorism and non-proliferation. I think we need to maintain an international system in which the United States has better relations with most other great powers in the system than they have with each other. And I would point specifically there to Russia and China. And Russia and China are the most powerful of the countries in the world that don't like the international system, or at least don't like all aspects of the international system as it's currently constituted. And I think it should be a key goal of the United States to prevent an alignment between the two of them. We can challenge one of them and have a major dispute with one of them, but I think it would be best for us to do that with only one of them at a time, and not to create a situation where they would align with one another. So I think that's another one. Certainly the international trading system. And Colin talked a little bit about this, you know, freedom of navigation, free trade, other things like that. You know, that's off the top of my head what I would put at the top.
Ultimately, what the purpose of American foreign policy, in my opinion, should be to preserve the freedom, the system of government we have, and our way of life. That's sort of the starting point. Moving from that into how you do that starts getting complicated about tactics and strategies and the like. But at least that's where I start. The difference between now and, say, 1939 or 1940, before World War II, is that we thought, because of our oceans and the fact that the distances between us and the rest of the world were so much larger then, that we had a lot more room to isolate ourselves from the problems of the world, and we found that in World War II that was no longer a luxury we could afford. And then the Cold War hit, and we've been involved as a world leader ever since. And so as the world got smaller, our role in the world got larger. And now we're in a situation where, as a world leader, the freedom, way of life, our limited, the system of government that we have, everything has a higher stake. We live in a nuclear age. We live in a world of global terrorism. People can reach us and threaten us in ways that they could not do in the 1920s and 1930s. And so we must be engaged in a sort of a forward defense of our interests around the world, more so than certainly we were prior to World War II, but over the last 60, 70 years, we have seen as necessary for a global strategy. So that's the way I think about it, and everything else comes from that. Keep the sea lanes of communication open so you can have international trade. Our economy would collapse without international trade. So it's not just, I like free trade because I'm a conservative and it sounds good. Our economy depends on it, and that means you need to have sea lanes of communication open, and also other kinds of communication with the countries around the world. But when it comes down to hard power, in this scenario that I see it, it's when I say maintain a balance of power in favor of freedom, what I'm talking about there is preserving the international system that we are the leader of, both economically, politically, and geopolitically, and even in security. And if any other country, whether it's Russia or China or anybody else, ever makes a bid to overturn either our leadership role or that balance of power in a significant way, then we've got a serious existential problem. The other existential problem would be, of course, the attack on the mainland has happened in 9/11. So that's why we were engaged in the war on terrorism. We can debate whether we did that right or not, but that's why we did it. My point is that geopolitically, we need not only need to be engaged militarily in the war, but we also need to pick and choose not only our interests, but our allies and our friends and who we're willing to protect very carefully. And that was, of course, we had the NATO alliance, was formed in the Cold War. Frankly, NATO's not all that, Europe's not all that threatened these days. Now it's all about the Middle East, and who do we pick and choose there as the countries that we're going to intervene in and defend. And so it's a wide open question that we're trying to answer. But I'm saying that if you ask yourself the question whether we should intervene in Syria, or even whether or not chemical weapons being used, as horrible as it is and as a challenge it is to our morality, if you're going to use military force, and particularly commit the United States beyond just mere symbolism, beyond mere punishment, but to actually have some effect, as Paul is saying, that you're actually going to go to the mat, because this is a vital interest and we're going to use force. People are going to die. It's got to be damn well important, and you've got to have some expectation that the use of it is going to have a positive outcome. Frankly, not only geopolitically, but even morally, if you want to look at it that way. And it can't be done lightly, and it should not be done as a part of sort of grandstanding on the basis of politicians.
Right. I mean, there's a striking pattern in the last few years. Most Americans have said, overwhelming majority have said they think the country's on the wrong track since about 2005. And there were just little blips after Obama's election, re-election, but it's been 70-30, I mean, very lopsided. And that affects the way people think about foreign policy, too. There's a tendency to overlearn the mistakes from Iraq and be very pessimistic and to say, everything's under Iraq. You know, we can't get anything right. Why even get out of bed in the morning? Well, I mean, that's right. I mean,
and we had the opposite problem before that because of the Gulf War and winning the Cold Wars. We couldn't do anything wrong.
Exactly. And so the critique that's made, which is, which you're hearing a lot right now, we can talk more about Syria later if you want. The critique that's made a lot in relation to Syria is it's obviously another Iraq. Well, it would have been very useful in 2003 to get it right in terms of making sure that the ends and the means matched up. That's a fair critique. But this is 10 years later. A lot has happened. Just one example. The Budget Control Act of 2011 said that you're going to have about $1 trillion in defense cuts over this decade, which the president's own cabinet says is completely unsustainable. There's no way to match up America's existing commitments with that level of defense spending. Nothing's being done about it, really. I mean, we're just kind of stumbling along. So there is a kind of a danger of a death of 1,000 cuts, and we're forgetting the big picture. I think, to answer your question, the big picture is, for 70 years, the United States has played a leading role in the world, which on balance has been much more benign than harmful. And it has made the world a safer place, a freer place, a more prosperous place, and it's been great for the United States, too. I don't want to see that erode either by choice or by accident. And I would want to maintain that system and consciously make efforts to maintain it.
Yeah.
But I want to agree with both Colin and Kim, what they said, which I think was very profound, each in his own way. Let me just add very briefly, because you asked for justification and Colin was mentioning public opinion. You know, I think the American people actually are pretty good judges of what our priorities should be in foreign policy. And if we look back at the last probably 30 years of public opinion polling, when you ask Americans what do you think should be our nation's highest priority, there are 4 issues that are always at the top. And the order changes depending on what people are worried about at any given time. But it's always jobs, nuclear nonproliferation, terrorism, and energy. Those 4 things. I think that's a good place to start.
Okay, good. Thank you. Who's next? Yes, sir.
Be Du Bois, community affairs consultants. Dr. Holmes, you mentioned that our president's heart is not in foreign policy. Isn't it true, sir, that the only qualification that you can find for that is the fact that President Obama has not declared war on any legitimate nation state?
No. As a matter of fact, that didn't occur to me as a criteria for it. There's been many newspaper articles where they've interviewed people who had worked in the White House on foreign policy, and some of them have come away and have talked about the fact that the President of the United States is more engaged in domestic policy than he is in foreign policy. I suppose that could be a criticism. On the other hand, it doesn't necessarily have to be, in the sense that given what I'm talking about here, and one of the reasons why I raised this, is that there is a mood in this country where there is not a given what's happened in the last decade or so, there's not a lot of interest in taking risky military interventions. And you find this on the left and the right. I think that President Obama is in that mood, if you will. But I think also he's, given the amount of time that he takes in pursuing his domestic agendas, whether it's Obamacare or what he did in the first 2 years of his term, and what he's done since. The fact is that, and the reluctance that he's shown to get involved not only in Syria, but also in other areas where there's any degree of risk, or particularly high degree of risk, I just don't see a willingness to undertake those risks. And as a matter of fact, the criticism that's coming from the left wing of his own party about not being more interventionist for humanitarian purposes, and also even saying that he's making compromises with the Bush counterterrorism regime, they actually are the ones, like I mentioned, Michael Crapon was criticizing, and Michael is an old liberal from way back. He accused the president of having an ambitionless foreign policy. So I think that it's not coming just from Republicans, but also from Democrats.
You know, if I could add a little bit to that, and you know, I imagine it may have come through a little bit from my comments that I'm not necessarily a big supporter of military interventions all over the place. I mean, there are times that we need to do it. As Kim said, there are some times when we've done it when perhaps we didn't need to do it. I think as I look at President Obama, I see a president who has a domestic vision and who does not have an international vision. And, you know, that's okay. It would be very difficult to pursue a domestic vision and an international vision at the same time. Richard Nixon had an international vision, and he didn't have much of a domestic vision. He accomplished a number of things in foreign policy, and he actually alienated a lot of conservatives with what he was willing to tolerate in domestic policy to avoid the political fights that would allow him to do what he wanted to do internationally. So, you know, that's, it's a model of being president that exists. It happens that President Obama has put much more energy and I would argue has a much more well-defined vision for a domestic agenda.
You want to say anything to that?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think in a way the international vision that President Obama has is the domestic vision. I mean, it's a spillover effect, right? So what you get is a foreign policy, and maybe you're seeing it again in Syria, where the overwhelming priority seems to be at any given moment, let's try to avoid distractions overseas if possible, but when we're forced to do something, we'll do the minimum necessary and sort of split the difference. That's not the same thing as actually having a coherent strategy or an international vision. There is a risk actually now. It looks as though the course that might be chosen in Syria is an extremely limited set of airstrikes, which you could say are the worst of all possible choices. I mean, you can make an argument and say, look, we don't have vital interest in Syria, let's stay out. You can also make an argument to say, let's try to get this right, okay? But the danger here is you've got a president who actually doesn't seem to be pursuing any sort of coherent strategy in Syria. So, you're going to get people criticizing from both sides. But I don't think the criticism, it's not a question of the president's motives. He has said himself what his goal was. When he ran, he said his vision was to transform America, to remake America. He's trying to push liberal or progressive legislation when possible, and he's very flexible on the details. But that is the agenda. It's not just about being reelected. It isn't just a cynical or a petty concern. He has great ambitions to be a great progressive president on domestic policy issues. It's just that if you think that's going to take the country in the wrong direction, as conservatives do, obviously you're going to disagree. And if you think that the country needs a coherent foreign policy strategy of any kind, you're going to think that the past 4 years have not been very impressive, except in rare moments like the Bin Laden strike.
Thank you. Anyone else? Right there.
My name is Jeremy Brenner. I'm a retired Foreign Service officer. I wonder if any or all of you would comment on the notion that with the end of conscription, we've become increasingly a military at war as opposed to a society at war, and that makes then military interventions easier, that a president is less required to reach consensus on what constitutes national interest, for example, and that there's less political pressure. That we didn't see, for example, the marching in the streets of the middle class calling for an end to the Iraq War.
The draft was ended when the Cold War was still on, and even before President Reagan was elected, and so it didn't have much of an effect on his sort of peace through strength strategy. I think if you wanted to, the reasons that I think both Paul and Colin, historical reasons about how is it we engaged in particularly the war in Iraq, the background on that is more importantly is that there was the experience, as I mentioned a minute ago, of the Gulf War being nearly painless. It was so short, and the Iraqi army just collapsed, and there was an expectation this would happen again. And then remember the phrase cakewalk. That came from that experience. And then it also came from, I think as Paul was saying, from the sense of confidence that came from winning the Cold War without firing a shot, as it was said by, was it Margaret Thatcher said that? So there was this confidence, and then there was, of course, the trauma of 9/11, and we're not going to let this stand, as President Bush said. I think that frankly, those historical markers are much more important than what happened with the draft. It's just my view.
That's interesting. One of the things you often hear talking to people in the career military is that they feel that there's such a gap between the popular image. The military is held in an extremely high esteem in America, and yet most people today, unlike during the Cold War, have no personal experience in it. So that causes a gap of understanding, and it's for example, it comes up in the sense that I just mentioned, which is what's the way you would handle an intervention like Syria from a strictly military point of view, right? Does it make sense to do it in a pinprick way? The career military mentality tends to be either win or go home. I mean, either get serious and do this right, or don't get involved in the first place. And so what you often hear from, say, the Joint Chiefs is the argument of let's be very careful beforehand, but then once we're in this, let's fight to win. Let's be serious. Let's do something meaningful to change facts on the ground. So again, this is exactly what we haven't seen. And to be fair, there's a pattern to this. It's bipartisan over the last 20 years. I mean, there have been cases under presidents from both parties. But there are also moments where presidents pull it together and get it right. I mean, in 2007, President Bush, I think, finally got it right in Iraq and matched up the ends and the means appropriately and kind of pulled it together. Part of it was by listening to one particular part of the career military, who were the dissidents at the time, and putting them in charge. So there's also different points of view within the career military as well.
I think I broadly agree with what each of Colin and Kim has said. I would just build a little bit off of one of Colin's points. I made the comment during my initial statement about our policymakers stopping thinking about consequences. I think the military is actually one of the small parts in our society where people continued to think about consequences because they have to. It has immediate, tangible impact on people's lives. There is one other part of our society where people think a lot about consequences, and that I think is in business. You make a decision, it has a result, and you see it right away. I think, it doesn't respond directly to your question, but I think if we could bring into our decision-making process a little bit of the sensibility that people in those two communities have, it would go a long way toward addressing our challenges.
It's right over there.
Hi, Doug Brooks, independent consultant. I used to run the trade association for companies that work in conflict and post-conflict and disaster relief operations. I like the concept that you brought up, Dr. Druk, on the 70 years of benign leadership by the United States, and I think that's fairly accurate. And I think many of the recent success stories have actually been very quietly achieved, and I would consider Bosnia and Somalia. We're seeing changes there, Cote d'Ivoire, East Timor. I think those are success stories where U.S. policies have been relatively benign but supportive of sort of a larger international effort. Libya I would include in that as well. And I think one thing that we do see from Obama is something that I think all presidents are probably going to do in the future, which is a more behind-the-scenes covert use of force. So we see a lot more of the special forces being used instead of invasions. We see the UAVs being used instead of aerial strikes and so on. It's a fairly low-risk strategy, but it seems to have had some impact, and I think people can debate the level of impact. But nevertheless, to me, this is sort of the lessons we're learning from Obama. And my guess, and I would love your opinion or perspectives on this, is this the way that future presidents are going to work? Or are we still going to reach for the big gun as we did in Iraq, which and even in Afghanistan with relatively mixed results?
No, I think you've got it right. I mean, the trend has been toward kind of light footprints, using drones, special operations, avoiding these heavy ground commitments, and for obvious reasons. I mean, it's the combination of public resistance and just no appetite for it. Whether that lasts forever or not is a different story, but that's definitely where we're at now. There is a risk there. It's not so much that, we should really be sending, thousands of American troops into Syria. That's not what I'm arguing. But there are cases where, again, the lessons of Iraq are overlearned. Libya would be one case. In Libya, the light footprint was so light that I would suggest that the White House didn't even do the minimum in terms of diplomatic engagement to make sure that Libya didn't turn into essentially a failed state. I mean, I think the verdict is still out on Libya. Right now, Libya it's extremely. I'm curious to hear what you think, but it seems to me it's extremely chaotic. There's lots of opportunities for jihadist militants in Libya, and I think that part of the problem was the administration was so focused on the concept of a light footprint that they overreacted in a way by doing not enough. So there's a risk to this, but it's obvious why it's being done, which is there's very little appetite for the heavy footprint.
Let me differ a little bit from Colin on Libya, which isn't where the question maybe was headed, but I would put Libya into the category of optional conflicts with probably negative unintended consequences. Even setting aside what's happening inside Libya, which is very unfortunate and doesn't look like it's headed in the right direction. But just to recall, and I'm sure, Kim, you recall very well, having been in the administration, The Bush administration agreed with the government of Libya that the government of Libya would give up its weapons of mass destruction programs, and we would take a live and let live approach to Gaddafi. And then, we decided to do what we did in Libya despite that. Now, in a situation where we hope to persuade Iran to give up its nuclear weapons without having to go to war with Iran, I would argue that that was not an ideal decision. And, it's a complicated issue. People could argue that Gaddafi sort of changed the deal by what he was doing internally. There are a lot of different aspects to that. But I would differ a little bit there. On the original question of the drones, I'll just add one thing very briefly. I think we are moving in that direction. I guess my question is, what happens when other major governments start moving in that same direction too, in addressing their own concerns? And when China starts using drones, when Russia starts using drones, when Pakistan starts using drones, it's a relatively inexpensive technology. It looks like it's becoming increasingly widely available, and not necessarily a good thing for everyone to be using that.
You mentioned some examples of success in Africa, and which reminded me of the remarks I was making in my opening statements about international governance in the United Nations, whether or not we should be rethinking about how we approach this, because the argument could be made. As a matter of fact, I heard it from some people at DOD when I was in the State Department, when we were thinking about intervening in Haiti, for example. The last thing the DOD wanted to do was intervene in Haiti, and so they were calling my office over in the Bureau of International Organizations, says, can you do something to get the UN involved there as quickly as possible so we don't have to do anything there, or if we do, we can get out very quickly. I saw that in the assault in Liberia. There's a similar situation there. So the idea of using the UN and peacekeeping or peace enforcement as a substitute for the use of kinetic force, particularly if it's the United States doing it, could be used as an argument as a substitute, if you will, that can maintain the standard of international peace and stability that they talk about at the UN, which is very different from balance of power and what I'm talking about here. But to do that, though, would mean that if we at the United States sort of adopted that point of view, and frankly, a lot of people in the Democratic Party and the State Department do, that is the standard, that international peace and stability as understood by the UN should be the standard, and that we need to be doing more in UN peacekeeping, and be more in soft power, more in foreign aid, and all these other things in order to prevent these conflicts from occurring. I think that particular approach is getting exhausted as well. It's not working as well as it used to before, and there's a lot of reasons for that because I can't get into it right now. But certainly the approach of the United Nations to peacekeeping, which is very often seen as a sort of a plaything of the Europeans, particularly the French, about maintaining their own spheres of influence in Africa. The French like to go into Cote d'Ivoire and places like that. They go in with the French troops, and then they're immediately on the phone 3 days later trying to get the UN to bring in peacekeepers from India, Pakistan, or wherever else in order to substitute for the French troops so they can get back. But whatever was bothering their interests, they took care of it. So there is that problem coming from the European politics, but there's also the way the UN peacekeeping does peacekeeping that would have to be looked at as well. So I don't necessarily think that's a substitute for what I'm talking about. We got two right down here. We've got 5 minutes left. I got an idea. Why don't we get both of you make your comments or questions, and then we'll kind of close it up and wrap it up. So who wants to go first here? Both of you can get a microphone, and you can fight over who talks first.
Save the best for last.
Oh, save the best for last. Okay. Okay.
Ed Verona. I'm an independent consultant.
Yeah.
I agree with what has been said about the lack of a comprehensive foreign policy vision in the Obama administration, but there's been no lack of rhetorical flourishes, whether it was extending the hand of friendship to countries that not until recently had been seen as adversaries, only to be rebuffed on a couple of very notable instances, or whether it was drawing red lines, which turned out to be rather blurry in application, or pivot to Asia, which has caused consternation among our traditional allies in Europe, for example, where we will be decreasing our strength to increase it in the Western Pacific, which touches upon some of those vital interests that you may have referred to, Paul, which are commitment to keeping sea lanes open, treaty obligations to countries in the region. So we have the inverse of Teddy Roosevelt's policy. We've got the policy of talk loudly, have a small stick. How are we going to deal with those specific, that particular one, the pivot to Asia, and is our relationship with China, our obligations to countries in Southeast Asia, particularly also to Japan, to Taiwan? Thank you.
You want to go first on Asia?
Oh, were you going to take the second?
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Oh, sorry, but I forgot you. Yeah, go ahead. Thanks.
Colleen Waterston with the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition.
Yeah.
So much of the discussion has been around military power and that hard power approach to foreign affairs. I'm wondering your perspectives on where development and diplomacy do have a role in the future of foreign affairs of our strategies.
Okay, I'll take the diplomacy one, and then you can take whatever you wish, the Asia or diplomacy. In this, I was going to talk about this at the end, but I've been waiting for an opportunity to plug my book, and you didn't. and rather than doing it artificially at the end, I'm going to do it. Address that question in this book. There is, by the way, flyers out there on the table. It's a book that's being published by Roman Littlefield. Comes out in November. It's called Rebound: Getting America Back to Great. I have 1/3 of it is about what do we do about foreign policy, and much of what I'm talking about here is elaborated in that book. So if you want to pre-order it, just grab one of these and go on to either Amazon or some other bookstore and do it. But the answer, what I talk about in the book, I have a section called The Diplomacy of Tomorrow. And I was at the State Department. I take diplomacy very seriously, but it also means that I had an opportunity to see what diplomacy really is and what diplomats really do. Diplomats are trained as observers, reporters, negotiators, and not much more than that. They're not intelligence operatives. They're certainly not good military planners. They're not good managers in the sense of thinking that somehow you can have conflict resolution where you put the State Department in charge of a task force where you've got generals sitting around the table. You don't want to put a Foreign Service officer in charge of that operation. So it's important to have the diplomats concentrate on what they do best and what they're trained for. And so that means scaling back some of the rhetoric about what you expect diplomacy to do. Unfortunately, this administration is big on rhetoric. The rhetoric changes from time to time, but it inflates the expectation. John Kerry said, what we need are more diplomats and fewer soldiers, or something as if they're interchangeable, as if power, are identically interchangeable. This business of having the State Department concentrate so much on organization of conflict resolution, I think is not such a great idea. I think that the days of soft power and seeing foreign aid as changing the world, even though it may be hard for many of our liberal friends to admit it, and I guess Colin would say they're not going to admit it, but privately some of them do to me, and there's nothing wrong with that. Downscaling some of the utopian expectations, not only of international governance, but also of soft power, would mean that we could preserve what works a lot better and not have these sort of senseless ideological debates that mainly are about the kind of rhetoric that Paul is talking about, that sometimes we are having foreign policy debates at the rhetorical level, not at the real level of what we can and cannot do. So we need to scale back a little bit of what we expect from the State Department and diplomats, and as well as the ideology of the rhetoric of what's behind that the State Department is suddenly going to be the main leader of all American foreign policy, and they're going to lead and tell the Department of Defense what to do. The National Security Council will decide American foreign policy, and everybody needs to be at the table. And the State Department is not really good at leading that. That's what I think about that.
Well,
Sure.
Why don't you go on?
Yeah, I think you mentioned foreign aid as one of the soft power elements. Actually, this is where Bush was interesting. One of the ways he was interesting, the traditional Republican foreign policy approach wasn't enthusiastic about foreign aid, and of course President Bush took it in a different direction. He, in some ways, championed it and reformed it. And one of the legacies he had, I mean, there's a lot of lives saved in Africa, actually, and it's not one of the things that's most discussed about his legacy, but it's very real. I don't see how the U.S. can be the world's only superpower if we slash and burn foreign aid. Obviously, a lot of it is, you know, there's abuse, there's misuse. We need to get serious about looking closely at it and holding people accountable. But I mean, what we spend on foreign aid is really not very much in a comparative sense, either comparative to other countries or comparative to our role in the world. So that's just my view. On the pivot, or rebalancing, which was the renaming of the pivot, this is a great example of where ends and means just don't add up. Strategy is all about ends and means. We keep talking about how that has to cohere and how it hasn't cohered lately. And certainly this isn't the first president where that's been the case. But the pivot is a classic case. I mean, you're cutting the Navy, and yet you're saying, or you're cutting the Navy really quite deeply, and yet you're saying we're going to rebalance toward the Pacific. People there can see that it doesn't add up. The Chinese can see it, US allies can see it, it's quite visible. So this is where rhetorical flourishes, like saying the word pivot, aren't very convincing if they're not actually supported by action. So, you know, that's Exhibit A right there. You cannot have the pivot and cut the Navy at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I would basically agree with Colin on assistance. I guess I would make a little bit of a distinction between humanitarian assistance and development assistance, in the sense that you know, it's much simpler to assess the success of humanitarian assistance efforts than it is to assess the success of development assistance. And you know, the track record on development assistance clearly is pretty mixed. So I think I wouldn't necessarily suggest slash and burn, but I think we do need to take a hard look at how we do things and try to find approaches that work better. On the rebalancing, I completely agree, Ed, with the premise of the question. You know, I think there is too often a big gap between rhetoric and reality in what the president says, and that's a case where he managed to find, and others in the administration managed to find a policy that did just enough to kind of concern the Chinese without actually deterring or intimidating them, while at the same time doing not quite enough really to reassure our allies about what's happening in Asia. And I think it's very problematic, and it's something that's happened time and again. I mean, if you look back at the president's Cairo speech from 2009, and you compare it, you know, to Egypt now, and actually to all of the different things that have been said about Egypt during the intervening period, just way off target on rhetoric versus reality. So I think you put your finger right on a big problem, and you know, I'm not sure really what to do about it. I mean, we have a president who likes to make sweeping rhetorical statements, but wants to concentrate on domestic policy. And I'm not sure that we can necessarily change either of those things until we get an opportunity to have a different president.
Actually, changing of opinions on development assistance over the last 30 years is a good example of how views on an issue like this can change sort of below the political radar, and can change gradually. Because it's not such a big question, you know, like what do you do with military power and the like, or things that presidents make their careers on, getting to the point of Colin answering my question, is a bipartisan consensus possible? I didn't say bipartisan, I just said consensus because I was trying to qualify it. But his answer was that, well, the president makes foreign policy, and that is, of course, true. But if you look, I remember when we started the Index of Economic Freedom back in the mid-'90s when Clinton was president, and we were proposing the idea of putting conditions on development aid or foreign aid. It was reacted to by a lot of people, particularly Democrats, with a lot of hostility, because it goes against the idea of that was around since the 60s and the beginning of AID, that you really shouldn't, these people need the aid regardless of whether or not they're using it wisely or not. But eventually, of course, the Bush administration set up the Millennium Challenge account, and President Obama, in some different ways, but he is continuing that. And so, yes, the president made that change, but there wasn't any desire to go back and completely deconstruct it, because I think even in the expert community, ideas had changed about development aid, where conditionality wasn't such a bad thing. Subtle, but that's what happens when you have these discussions, and eventually experts kind of see eye to eye, but sometimes you have to have it in conference rooms and not out in front of the media. All right, I think that we've come to the end of our time. I want to thank, first of all, Paul and Colin for coming here. This is exactly what I hoped would happen. Thank you for your excellent presentations. Thank all of you for coming as well. Excellent questions. Once again, the next one is on September 8th, September 18th. It'll be either in this room or in Lehrman Auditorium downstairs. Featuring Ted Broman, who is here with us today, Will Imboden, and Rich Williamson. We'll be asking them similar questions, and then if we get the same answer, then we'll stop doing this and we'll do something else. But if we get a different answer, I might do one more, because it depends on whether or not you start reaching any new insights. That's the reason why we're doing this. Or maybe we just change it, start asking different questions, who knows. But anyway, thank all of you very much for coming today, and I hope to see you on September 18th.